This photo was taken by students who had formed a community policing force. This photo, as you imagine, went viral pretty quickly because it's a unique mixture of the ridiculous and the frightful. I've heard from a friend that one of the members of this group was kicked out of the group and called a traitor or some sort of snitch, and they terrorized her to such an extent that she moved out of the state. Now, of course, knowing these people, she probably was overreacting just as much as her oppressors were overreacting, and she probably had to leave the state anyways because it was the end of the school year. Of course, it's pretty understandable how a group like this would form. You have a charismatic person, and you have a bunch of other people on the same page as him, and then you have a cause or a purpose, and then things get really rowdy, and so you galvanize the group together. I want to show y'all that Evergreen actually has housing set up to foster a group like this to come into being. And one of the housing groups that I've found is the Multicultural Mansion. And this is from their webpage. This space is committed to promoting anti-oppression and discussions on race for students of various ethnicities. The Multicultural Mansion is here to promote personal growth and community building within a safer, supportive environment. So the resident expectations are to participate in the creation of a learn living agreement with roommates facilitated by a resident assistant to ensure each resident's needs are met within the apartment. So there's some sort of contract that binds everybody together. Residents are expected to abide by the community rules. Residents are expected to attend at least 3 meetings per quarter of a registered student group that promotes social justice. This may include, but is not limited to, and then these various different student groups. They must attend at least one anti-oppression or identity-building workshop per quarter. Everyone who lives here must make the commitment and effort to recognize their privilege and work in solidarity with oppressed groups in the struggle for justice. Allies understand that it is in their own interest to end all forms of oppression, even those from which they may benefit in concrete ways. Now, in my previous videos, I've spoke about an anti-oppression workshop that I had to go to as part of my student employment. And this past year, at the beginning, we were handed this handout, and I just want to briefly look over it. This is the first page, and it totally just sparked my angst on a number of different levels, but it's called To Equalize Power Among Us, Tools for Change. We can make active choices to create the space for transformation. For those of us who bring the pattern of privilege, here are some guidelines to help us equalize relations. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. To create a context which embraces diversity, in which no one is marginalized, a conscious and ongoing effort is required. Noticing and changing what we take for granted, we make room for everyone's contribution. From a place of fair witness, with a desire to examine our sensitivity to respecting boundaries in the presence of power imbalances, consider the following questions. And then there's a bunch of questions that will help you check your privilege. And they're very, very, very passive-aggressive so far as I'm concerned. And I think that that comes from feminism. Feminism, at a certain point, they decided to go after this thing called the patriarchy. And I think that subconsciously they started to despise even the positive aspects of what they call patriarchy. And one of the positive aspects of patriarchy is this thing called the law. That is, the archetypical law is found in the Old Testament. Right? And how that law is formed is through a series of do-nots. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that, thou shalt not do this, and that, and this, and that, and thou shalt do this. And it's very, very direct, right? And I think that that's the paradigm of the masculine order. It's very direct, it's very hard, and in a certain extent, it's very black and white, to its detriment, right? And so I think that this movement, because it derives from feminism, and feminism is anti-male to a certain extent, even subconsciously, it takes the opposite tact. And instead of being direct, like the paternal order would be, it's very indirect, as a maternal order would be, right? And so if the negative aspect of patriarchy is that it's very black and white and there's marginalization that happens, the negative aspect of matriarchy is that it's very passive-aggressive, and it uses guilt to shape behavior. Now, that's a side point. Now, I want to make one more side point before I get on to the meat of the matter, and say that when I was handed this handout, I zoomed in on this little text box, and it says, "In the ways we've been oppressed." Chaos theory and study of complex adaptive systems teaches that the richest innovations and learning happen at the margin. Yet, we tend to ignore the margins. Those with privilege have never needed to understand the experience of others. Offending behaviors may not be calculated to protect power, but simply a reflection of ignorance reinforced by complacency, right? So again, it's this, you might not know that you're doing something wrong. You're just being complacent, right? It's very passive aggressive. But there's two things in this little text box that really riled me up. The first one is the first sentence. Chaos theory and study of complex adaptive systems teaches that the richest innovations and learning happen at the margin. Now, chaos theory and study of complex adaptive systems does not teach that the richest innovations and learning happen at the margin. Chaos theory and study of complex adaptive systems, so far as I know, is a study produced by very geeky people hidden in some corner of some grad school, like iterating and iterating and iterating and iterating and iterating these tiny little processes in order to kind of formulate certain theories that can help us understand exceedingly complex systems, right? It doesn't teach the richest learning happen at the margin. But aside that, whoever wrote this pamphlet is using hard science to kind of claim authority, right? It's disarming our skepticism by saying that skepticism has already been applied to this system. We've already done our research into chaos and study of complex adaptive systems. Ergo, we tend to ignore the margins. Those with privilege have never needed to understand the experience of others. Now, there's 2 points I want to make about this. One is that this is a rhetorical trick to put you in your place. It's a way of shutting down any sort of skepticism. It's a way of shutting down any sort of criticism of the argument by saying that your criticism, it's from some sort of subconscious inherent predisposition that you have, and we need to reprogram you. Like in my last video, there was a Marxist economist who said that we all arrive at college with this operating system in the background. Now, implicitly what he's saying is that we need to reprogram that operating system. And the second point I want to make about that statement is that yes, people with privilege have absolutely needed to understand the experience of others. That is how privilege is formed. In my way of looking at things, there is no first generation privilege. If you go far back enough, there was just people in the dirt, and one person decided to bust their ass to get something done and to get something. And then their children had a little bit easier, and maybe one of those children busted their ass and got a little bit more, and then their children had a little bit easier, but one of their children worked their ass off a little bit more. So there's no such thing as first generation privilege. Privilege is just that there are these layers of ignored effort that has gone into where we've gotten now. I think that there's this vision of a utopia society where everybody just sits around and sips dainties, right, and whips the people who go and get us more dainties, right? When I say that the bourgeoisie, those who sit around sipping dainties, they don't really matter. The only people who actually matter, the only people who actually are privileged are the ones who create value. And what is value? Is value taken from others, or is it created, right? If you say that it's only ever taken, that's basically, I think, is a nihilistic view of how the world works, right? When I say that, no, value is created, and the way that value is created, there's a little bit of luck, and there's some resources, and there's a whole lot of effort. There's a whole lot of effort. And so privilege actually comes from responsibility. Privilege doesn't come from some sort of ability to just sit around and expend all these resources that were stolen. And yes, people like that do exist, but those people don't really matter. In my philosophy, those people are not to be envied whatsoever. Anyway, so that is a long way of getting to the second page of this handout. And here's where I can bring it home. So on the reverse side of this handout was this other sheet that reads common behavioral patterns that perpetuate relations of domination. Power is the ability to act. The more access to resources one has, the more options one has. Power differences are expressed in institutional and cultural contexts. These power differences continually inform our interpersonal relationships. The following patterns are common ways people learn to interact in a hierarchical society. To not conform to expected behavior risks social ostracism, privilege, and/or one's survival. These are relational patterns taking place in correspondence to each other. They are tendencies, not personality characteristics. They are to be read horizontally. If these patterns are present, people find themselves duplicating the dominant culture's injustice, even when they aspire to egalitarian relationships. When the patterns are broken, space is made for justice. Okay, so this is my argument that these anti-oppression workshops, they have a tremendous capacity to backfire, because what they're teaching is that there's this dominant group and this oppressed group, and this dominant group acts in one way, and the oppressed group acts in another way, and therefore, ergo, the oppressed people need to act like the dominant people and dominate the dominators, right? And then to oppress them. And this handout is so explicit in its statement of certain behaviors that are manifested in the protests, right? So the dominant group defines rules, judges what is appropriate, and patronizes. The dominant group is seen as and feels capable of making constructive changes. The dominant group assumes responsibility for keeping a system on course, acts without checking in with others. Self-image of superiority, competence, in control, entitled, correct, presumptuous, does not listen, interrupts, raises voice, bullies, threatens violence, becomes violent, seeks to stand out as special, assumes anything is possible, can do whatever one wants, assumes everyone else can too, initiates, manages, plans, projects, sees problems and situations in personal terms, sees experiences and feelings as unique, feels disconnected, often needs to verbalize feelings, sees solutions to problems as promoting better feelings, thinks own view of reality is only one, assumes everyone agrees with their view. Disagreements are result of lack of information, misunderstandings, and/or personalities, views self as logical, rational, sees others as too emotional, out of control, believes certain kinds of work below their dignity. Good Lord, every single one of these things has been manifested in the videos. If you go back and you look through the videos of the protests, every one of these group dynamics is in play. So this is what's being taught, right? And at Evergreen, there is a specific cell, right? There's a specific housing environment that you go to, and you are programmed to basically become a militant social justice warrior. And so I was handed this handout in September, and I kept it because it was just so outrageous to me. It was so outrageous to me, and then I lost it. And I went, after these protests happened, and after I started making these videos, I went online to find it, and I found that this handout comes from a manual called We Are the 99%. We Are Unstoppable. Another World is Possible. Catalyzing Liberation Toolkit. Anti-racist organizing to build the 99% movement. This is obviously a very militant handout, and it's being promulgated and taught by the First Peoples Multicultural Center at Evergreen. So I hope to be showing evidence that there is definite indoctrination going on here. And when you go to Evergreen, there's a lot of freedom and stuff, and there's these options that have been set up to help people who are marginalized, right? There are these groups and these departments that are set up specifically to help raise people up. But once I start looking at all the material that they're pushing on people, well, one, it's constantly upsetting to me that it's so freaking, the quality of the thought that's put into this stuff is always so shaky. I mean, just the grammar alone of this stuff, and then where this stuff comes from. Like, it's all this radical kind of fringe thinking group stuff about like the fringiest of the fringe and the cringiest of the cringe. And so it's no surprise that it produces the behavior that we've seen. It's no surprise that it produces these very self-important, very entitled sorts of actants who are not being trained to think through these things, and they're being trained by people who haven't actually gone through and like studied and to become really smart people themselves. And I don't mean to be lazy and call people stupid. I don't mean that, but there's evidence of a woeful lack of intellectual rigor going on. And combined with the ideology, it's a tempest that's bigger than a teapot. And so these different departments that are set up to help people, like the First Peoples Multicultural Department and TRIO, which is set up to lift up people who are from low income and minority groups. They're very noble. They're set up to do very good charitable work, but I'm going to do more videos and look closely at the people who are running these things, and not to criticize the people, but to criticize the ideas and the methodology, to show that this is the locus of what is giving rise and empowering this ill-begotten behavior. That can't even really see that far because it's so dim-witted to begin with, and I apologize for making intellect. That's a privilege that I have, that I refuse to check. But I understand that not everybody is set up to be intelligent. But at the same time, shouldn't the people who are being professors, shouldn't they be pursuing intellect? Shouldn't people who work at a college be pursuing not just helpful activity, but intellectual empowerment, intellectual betterment? And that's all I got for you today. I'm going to set up a Patreon if you want to help out with these videos. Anyways, ciao.